everyone. Thanks for joining us. Just want to introduce Victor. He is the Forest Health Program Manager for MNerd's Forestry Division, and he leads efforts to monitor and manage the health of our state's forests. His work focuses on addressing threats from insects, pathogens, and diseases that impact different forest ecosystems. And he oversees the state's Forest Health Program, which provides technical and financial assistance to landowners to mitigate risk from forest pests. And this includes managing the Forest Health Initiative, which is a cost share program that helps private forest lands prevent bark beetle infestations and other pest pressures. So with that, Victor, we can see your screen. Looks good. I will pass it over to you.
Good. Do I have audio as well?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to spend your lunch hour with me. Again, my name is Victor Lucero, and a little bit about what I do for the state of New Mexico. I have statewide responsibilities. I support our six districts that are located statewide, and I also provide technical support to primarily private entities, landowners, or agencies, and some of our partners. I also manage the invasive weeds program in addition to the Forest Health Initiative program, as well as conduct aerial surveys. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about. The Let's see. Yeah, so today, just want to share with you the results of the 2025 New Mexico Forest Health Conditions Report. This report is produced in cooperation with the U.S. Forest Service Region 3 Forest Health Protection Staff as we work together to track forest health conditions throughout New Mexico. So the pathway that I want to take today is take a look again at the forest health conditions in a brief summary. I'll speak about aerial detection survey, some of the methods. I've got some photos and a little video, as well as throughout the presentation, I'll have some aerial images that kind of lend a little bit more opportunity to see what, from the standpoint of an aerial survey in an airplane, what we look at. I'll talk about drought and warming conditions, damage causing agents, those agents being either insects or disease or abiotic situations that impact our forests and forest health. And then we'll have a conclusion and then time for question and answer. So in a nutshell, the summary of this past year with respect to the number of acres that have been that were monitored and recorded via aerial survey, total 209,000 acres. The breakdown there with state, private, national forests and tribal lands. The majority of the acres that were impacted occurred on national forests. Acres with defoliation, the same thing, the majority occurred on national forest lands. But you can also see that both state, private, and tribal lands are impacted. And then with respect to just the overall climate conditions, it was second warmest year on record. And obviously we don't have much with respect to precipitation, which leads to drought stress conditions and ultimately lead to drought predisposing large expanses of our forests and woodlands to bark beetle attack in particular. With respect to the total amount of damage, this includes mortality from insects, disease, defoliation. In 2025, there were 382,000 acres mapped, as opposed to 2024, where there was 406,000 acres mapped. Some of the things that we saw that led to the number of acres decrease from 24 and 25 was fewer acres mapped from western spruce budworm, which typically is a significant damage causing agent in mixed conifers that has a signature and allows for, in the hundreds of thousands of acres of defoliation. Using, the drought monitor tools, everybody recalls that, this past year definitely was a dry, warm year. At the beginning of 2025, the state experienced 35% in moderate drought conditions and 20% in severe drought. And as things progressed, by the end of the calendar year, December 31st, the state had 71% of its land mass in moderate drought and 52% of severe drought. The areas that the majority of specifically bark beetle activity that was mapped definitely coincided with the hotter, drier regions of the state. So, the southwestern region, the Gila region, down in the Sacramento area, definitely corresponded to drought-induced bark beetle attacks specifically. And unfortunately, it looks like, we're kind of leaning in that strong tendency currently. So a little bit about aerial detection survey. The program that I work with is in cooperation with the United States Forest Service aerial survey program out of the Region 3 office in Albuquerque, the New Mexico zone. And so, some of the mechanics of the program, we fly in a single engine high fixed wing aircraft. It's a Cessna 210 turbo, cramped quarters to say the least, with a pilot and at least two observers the majority of the time. Occasionally we'll have a trainee, so there can be up to four persons in the aircraft at one particular mission. And the length of the time that we try to spend in the air doing these aerial surveys, we try to get at least 4 hours per mission. So that's from takeoff, doing our surveys, and then ferrying back to the airport. So that it's a little bit, it sounds, that's not a big deal, but 4 hours of, confined space, no bio breaks, and always looking out the window can be a little taxing. The aerial survey itself maintains consistent flight lines so that the data that's collected year in and year out remains somewhat consecutive and consistent. And when it's all said and done, each year there is approximately 13.5 to 14 million acres in New Mexico on its forests and woodlands that are monitored. It's important to note that not every acre is mapped. There's lots and lots of private lands and state and federal lands that we just don't get to. So we try to make sure that everyone knows that this is a survey of forest health conditions as a result of aerial survey detection. And with respect to those individuals that are qualified to do surveys in New Mexico, at the state level, it's myself and one of my colleagues down in the Silver City area, Tom Zegler. And then there's two forest health protection staff out of Albuquerque, Crystal Tischler and Greg Reynolds, that are with the FHP staff out of Albuquerque. So it's not a big crew that we use. So we try to take turns flying each week. For example, Crystal and Greg are flying out of Albuquerque this week, and next week myself and Tom will be flying the Gila region, and the week after that myself and Crystal will be flying out of the Alamogordo Airport to survey the Lincoln, Sacramento area in that part of the state. So some of the things that we get to see from an aerial view are some pretty spectacular sights. Some spectacular in the sense of awesome in the negative. For example, flying over the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon burn scar, you can see just the mosaic of burned areas and refugia or green islands. And these are important sites to map post-fire because we want to keep track of those green islands, that refugia that can lend to potential natural reseeding of some of the landscape. So this photo taken last year, again, post-fire, these green islands, we fly again if they occur within our consistent and consecutive flight lines. We'll monitor these. Occasionally, if there is a request for uh, critical sites that may be impacted by forest health situations that we want to try to track, we may veer off of certain flight lines, but year in and year out, we try to maintain those consistent flight lines. In the upper elevation, Pecos Wilderness, for example, in one of our flight lines, we consistently pass through this one particular landscape where, the standing dead Engelmann spruce that we see, again, it's pretty awesome, if I could use that word, as we see an insect, spruce beetle, is the damage causing agent that killed all those trees. And then if you look a little closer towards that little pond, you'll see a sizable herd of elk. So we get to see some interesting things, some cool things. And for example, here's a real, took a photo of this, I believe it was last year, a thunderstorm on the Zuni Mountains as we were ferrying back to the airport. Once the conditions start becoming a little unsafe, if you will, we end the mission. So during the monsoon seasons, we try to be off the ground at 7:30 in the morning or earlier. And by about 11:30, 12, sometimes sooner, we start developing those puffy clouds, and we don't, we're not qualified or to use instrument flight rules. So we use visual flight rules. So that means that we can't fly in or through clouds. So we exit that particular landscape that we're surveying and get back to the airport. And this next slide is, it's about 30 seconds. It's a video of the Church Mountain area in the Sacramento. So it's a little shaky, bumpy, if you will, but that's kind of real-time situation that one would experience as an observer. So that was a lot going on there. I'm just going to go back and just, without turning the slide on, but there's a lot of activity going on here. You see a lot of mortality, the lower pinyon pine, there's ponderosa pine, and then on the upper reaches, there was Douglas fir beetle. So there's just a lot going on to map, and it can be a little taxing to keep your head on straight while you're flying through a landscape that's got a lot of signatures from different tree species that will that we try to map as accurately as possible. So occasionally I get questions, well, how do you know what tree you're looking at? Well, part of my training is to go through the training process to recognize the morphology of the trees from an elevated, from an aerial view. So for example, pinyon pine looks a lot different than Douglas fir, based on its shape. And also, and then, what makes it easy is when we look at both elevation and aspect. So lower elevation, you're probably not going to see, Engelmann spruce. So the majority of those situations make it a little bit easier when you just kind of track elevation and aspect. On north-facing slopes, for example, in a dry mixed conifer, you'll probably have fir and Douglas fir, as opposed to the south aspect, where you'd probably have a little bit more ponderosa pine, maybe some Douglas fir. So the next, we're going to talk about mortality agents, bark beetles. So mortality agents are those insects that feed on the phloem of the plant. They consume the vascular cambium. Feeding on that vascular cambium ultimately results in the tree not having resources that it can survive, but also these bark beetles introduce staining fungi that occlude the xylem vessels and hasten the death of the tree, if you will. With respect to the number of acres that we experienced in 2025 of total mortality of all tree species, all bark beetle species, went from 67,000 acres in 2024 to 209,000 acres in 2025. And just initial observations that we've had in just the last 5 weeks that we've been surveying, it looks that it's going to continue to go up in the number of acres that we'll map with all mortality, just because we haven't had, the cool, wet fall and winter that we would like to have, and things have just been terrifically hot and dry, predisposing trees again to bark beetle attack. The first mortality agent that we'll talk about is spruce beetle. Obviously, these are upper elevation insects that we typically begin flights in the northern part of the state, flying out of the Taos Municipal Airport. And the primary host of this animal is Engelmann spruce, occasionally blue spruce. But if you take a look at this picture, any of the kind of greenish yellow trees that are in this picture, those are all standing. They will be standing dead. They're dead. They just don't know it yet. And so that's the signature that we look when we're flying over these upper elevation areas. We look at the kind of the greening and yellowing fading, if you will, of the Engelmann spruce. You can see intermixed in here, there's some gray dead. And again, just an amazing sight to see when you correlate that with an insect that's about 4 millimeters long. So in 2025, we mapped about 8.3 or 8,300 acres of spruce mortality, and the majority of spruce in New Mexico, high elevation Engelmann spruce, does occur in the Carson and Santa Fe National Forest, and that's where we primarily map these sites. Last year, there was just shy of 10,000 acres that were mapped. And if you follow the graph back, you'll notice that about in 2013, 2014, things started to increase as far as the number of acres mapped. And that was following wind throw events in various national forests in those upper elevations. And what occurs in a wind throw situation, Douglas fir beetle prefer that type of material, so they'll capitalize on a wind throw event. Populations will build throughout that material. But those bark beetles need to go somewhere else, and so they'll overwhelm standing live trees in the landscape. And so if you look at some of the upper elevation Engelmann spruce stands, they're decimated in a good portion of the Pecos Wilderness, for example, and the higher reaches of the Carson, again following wind throw events. Again, taking a look from an aerial view, this little alpine pond area, it's in the Carson. Just drew this kind of a crude polygon that we would try to map as we're flying, documenting on a tablet. We would draw these areas and we would assign either a percentage of the trees or use a grid that's on our tablets to determine the percentage of trees that are impacted by this particular damage causing agent. But again, you could see within this polygon, there's gosh, just about every Engelmann spruce here has some degree of fading. There's other trees on the outskirts of this polygon. I just wanted to draw your attention to as you're conducting an aerial survey and looking at those signatures of a kind of a green-yellow fading of the canopy. That's what we use to document, again, this particular insect on Engelmann spruce. Here's an example of a wind throw event up in the Carson National Forest and subsequent fading of these trees as a result of spruce beetle flying out of the wind throw material and colonizing this basin. And it's just, it is a sight to see, again, whenever you see just, hundreds of acres being attacked by insects. And there's really nothing that one can do about that. It's just a natural native insect. There's not a whole lot of management opportunities, especially in wilderness sites. One thing to point out is whenever we're conducting these aerial surveys in the upper elevation, obviously we have to be mindful of, where we're at. The pilot just does a phenomenal job keeping us at the above ground elevation that we need to accurately make our observations, but also keep us safe about 1,000 feet above the highest peak. So we're conducting in these cases a contour, basically a series of loops in these upper elevations so that we can track and monitor activity and any drainage or basin within the landscape of higher elevation that host the Engelmann spruce, especially up in, like the Truchas Peaks area, some reaches of the Carson as well.
Victor, there's
And
a question in the chat. Can you define what
sure,
you mean when you say wind throw areas?
sure. So a wind throw event occurs when naturally occurring either a microburst or a wind event that causes the shearing of large numbers of trees within a forest, and those trees are toppled and they become suitable for, in this case of spruce beetles, to colonize. And that ultimately, once all the vascular cambium is consumed by the beetles, they complete their life cycle. It takes about a year for this particular insect to complete its life cycle. They can either reattack viable wind throw material, or once that material is no longer suitable for bark beetles to complete their biology, they subsequently fly to standing live trees. But again, this area, these two photos here showing, trying to show their location in drainages and basins that, again, doing that contour flying allows us to map these areas. And again, it's one of the things that can be difficult for a surveyor is the conditions. For example, a couple of years ago, we had some smoke from out of state forest fires blow in, and it's just trying to read signatures through haze can be a little challenging. And another shot of spruce beetle mortality in the Pecos wilderness. So all of these standing gray dead trees were attacked by spruce beetle post wind throw event. Moving on to the next mortality agent in ponderosa pine. Ponderosa pine is attacked by several different bark beetle species in the genus Dendroctonus and Ips. Both of these are tree killers, but Dendroctonus primarily is the more aggressive, if you will, tree killer. They typically attack the main stem, whereas Ips species typically attack the upper crown of the tree. This photo is down in the Sacramentos, but you can see just large pockets of ponderosa pine that are showing that characteristic kind of straw-colored fading of viewed from the air. So in 2025, with ponderosa pine specifically, we mapped 155,000 acres. 2024, there was 32,000 acres that were mapped. The majority of these 155,000 acres were on national forests. For example, the Gila, which was hit very hard, 123,000 acres of ponderosa pine mortality were mapped. In the Lincoln, 20,000 acres, and then the Cibola, 6,000. And there's scattering of state and private lands as well as tribal. But again, the majority of the mapping that occurred documenting the mortality event on ponderosa pine was on national forests. Little captions on the bottom of some of these graphs indicate the number of trees killed by insects, in this case, bark beetles in ponderosa. The last decade, 605,000 acres. And it's interesting to note that on most years, bark beetles kill more trees than wildfires. Again, these are, with respect to New Mexico, these are all native insects. They're not invasive, but they definitely, when conditions afford them the opportunity to capitalize on specifically drought-stressed trees, populations increase, as well as the overall resilience of forested stands decrease due to warming, drying conditions. I took this photo on the Gila, edited a little bit just so that I could bring out a little bit of the highlights from the fading bark beetle killed trees and contrasting it with the standing live. So it'll be interesting. We fly this next week. It'll be interesting to see what these landscapes will look like after, again, another dry year. But you can tell that there's no distinction between the site on the landscape that the insects are capitalizing on, as opposed to, let's just say, in the case of a land management decision situation where, when humans are involved, we would take, care to make sure that, the disease, the uglies, the dwarf mistletoe infected trees would be, thinned, removed, masticated, piled, lopped and scattered, pile burn, etc. But the bark beetles, they just indiscriminately attack whatever they are able to attack, focusing primarily initially on the most decadent trees, the most weakened trees. But then when populations of the beetles increase, they can overwhelm even the healthiest of trees. This little slide I put in just to, for those that may not know about the bark beetles, again, the two genera, Ips and Dendroctonus, there are some distinctions. They both, however, do feed on the phloem of the tree, the vascular tissue that keeps the tree alive. This on the left is a photo of a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a six-spined Ips. So that's an Ips calligraphus. And we can tell if we don't have the insect, what the insect is based on the gallery or these etchings that the insect creates on the sapwood just below the inner bark of the tree. So Ips species typically have I, Y, or H-shaped gallery. The wide portion right here is created by the male. It's the nuptial chamber. And the nuptial chamber, once it's created, the males emit an aggregation pheromone, a sex pheromone calling females to the site. Um, and once they're mated, in this case, there were 4 females, each gallery representing 1 female. The females will lay eggs on either side of the galleries, and the larvae, once the eggs are hatched, begin feeding outward away from the egg galleries, consuming the phloem tissue. On this side, we have a Dendroctonus species. This is Dendroctonus barbari, or southwestern pine beetle. And the elytral declivity, or the distal end of this bark beetle, does not have spines. It's a rounded shape. And the galleries of Dendroctonus species are somewhat characteristic in that they oftentimes are real messy looking. They have oftentimes are frass packed, or frass is a fancy word for insect excrement mixed with sawdust. But you could see these galleries kind of have no rhyme or reason. They're a nickname of this particular insect would be spaghetti western, meaning that if you were to get a bowl of spaghetti and just kind of throw it on a tree, it just kind of has a random shape, nothing there. But this gallery, again, is is a characteristic distinction of this Dendroctonus barbari that, again, attacks ponderosa pine. So, but there's about 12 species of bark beetles that will attack ponderosa pine. If you don't have the insect, oftentimes you can identify it again by the galleries that they create and leave behind. Next are the mixed conifer bark beetles, specifically Douglas fir beetle. Occasionally, white fir we track with the fir engraver beetle. This shot right here is in the Carson National Forest, and all these red fading trees are Douglas fir beetle, and that is the characteristic color that Douglas fir fades, kind of a sorrel or a reddish color of the canopy. And in 2025, we mapped 11,000 acres of mixed conifer, primarily Douglas fir beetle, different in populations that occurred between 2024 and 2025 is that we had more activity in Douglas fir and fir engraver. So we had almost 20,000 acres mapped in 2024 of mixed conifer bark beetles. And again, over the last decade, 211,000 acres have been mapped in mixed conifer, again, specifically with Douglas fir beetle and fir engraver beetles. When one is flying over a landscape, the trees, again, they do take on a different hue. Kind of a funky picture here on the left, I apologize, but white fir, fades kind of an orange color, but also the shape of the tree is different from the air, kind of a little bit more pointed, if you will. And opposed to the on the right here, we have Douglas fir beetle leaving that characteristic reddish kind of a sorrel photo. I took this just above Santa Fe, just to show that this, again, is a very distinct photo. And then mixed in here, you could see that there's some previous mortality that's standing gray dead. We don't have time. One of the things that we're starting to see this year on the upper elevations in our early season surveys is that we're starting to see a pretty significant pickup in uptick in Douglas fir mortality. So I snuck in this year's photo showing, the stand of about 60 trees right in here of mature Douglas fir being attacked by Douglas fir beetle. And it's interesting that this particular animal prefers large diameter Douglas fir. Which is, as far as, when land management can take place, selective logging of larger diameter trees because again, the insect knows that it needs a suitable host to maintain the biology of its brood, and so large diameter Doug fir definitely preferred by this animal, as well as another thing that impacts the vulnerability of Douglas fir is armillaria root disease. So those areas in our forests, and there's a lot of them, a lot of the areas that have armillaria up above, for example, Santa Fe, there's a lot of activity of Douglas fir beetle, especially in those areas that have been infected by armillaria root disease. Close up of the Doug fir beetle, the egg and larval galleries. So again, a frass packed. Can you see my cursor moving? Good. So right here, you've got a vertical egg gallery that the females have created, and on either side she's deposited eggs. It's kind of a little challenging to see from here, but once the eggs hatch, the larvae radiate perpendicular to the wood grain, and then they alternate egg gallery. So here's another example of a larval gallery, but again, they are able to consume large amounts of vascular tissue in a short period of time. This close up right here of the enclosed beetle feeding just outside the inside on the inner bark. And then this is a photo that I borrowed from the Oregon Department of Agriculture, but this beetle has a black head and thorax and a kind of a reddish abdomen, or the elytral covering the shell, if you will. But again, the Doug fir beetle leaves this distinct kind of a messy gallery where it spends its entire life cycle, except for the adults that leave in search of other hosts. And again, you can see in the post-fire image here of the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon, pockets of Douglas fir mortality by Douglas fir beetle. So one of the things that is very characteristic post-fire, after this, we don't map burned areas, wildfire scars, until the second full year after the fire, because it's somewhat challenging oftentimes to discern between fire killed trees and bark beetle killed trees, but all of these are bark beetle killed trees post fire. So we oftentimes see along the margins of a burn scar where these trees did experience stress from that fire event, that bark beetles will continue to capitalize on those weakened trees. The next insect is the pinyon ips, Ips confusus. This little close-up shot of a pocket of pinyon ips killed trees in the East Mountains next to a home, and in the grand scheme of landscapes that are neighboring in wildland urban interfaces, these definitely obviously produce concern for landowners when they've got a bunch of standing dead, as it would correlate to the potential for fuels on their landscape. And if you take a look back a handful of years, in 2022, there was just this huge spike in pinyon nips activity that subsequently dropped to like just a few hundred acres last year. But this past year, we mapped 33,000 acres of pinyon nips statewide, the majority on national forests, and the majority in Catron and Grant County and part of Otero County. So it looks like I don't have a crystal ball, but based on our initial surveys and looking at things from the ground, we're going to see significant numbers of bark beetles this year. So when conducting an aerial survey, these two little polygons right here, we would see, moderate severity of bark beetle activity within this pinyon stand. But looking at, again, in Grant County, every you know tree just about in some of these areas, we almost had 100% mortality in highly overly stocked stands of pinyon pine. Again, a little bit of editing just to show the number of trees that were attacked and killed by pinyon nips, and a ground view near the Daddle area, showing again that just conducting ground surveys, ground truthing, that it's pretty daunting, quite daunting to see the number of trees that were attacked. Interesting photo right here. Not just, we'll call it just an anomaly of our flight line. There was this previously treated landscape where all of these, the majority of these trees are pinyon pine. There's a scattering of juniper, but blowing out the photo, we see the benefits of stand reduction, thinning. These orange lines right here represent areas that within this landscape had some bark beetle activity, but these large swaths or these large polygons in red, and show that wherever there's high densities of stressed trees, bark beetles are just going to capitalize on those sites. There's, as the saying goes, there's too many straws in the cup. Every tree is competing for soil moisture. They're highly stressed and extremely susceptible to bark beetle attack. This photo I took back in December in that general area near Daddle. It was so warm, we were just kind of, curious just to see what the insects are doing in December when we didn't have much of a winter. And instead of being tucked in, in a diapause state or an insect hibernation state, these insects were actively feeding on the phloem. So you could see this line of bark beetles right here, and they've just completely consumed all the vascular cambium. So we have a situation this past spring where we had a bunch of bark beetles in good shape, and it'll be interesting again to see what the numbers look like for 2026. Before I forget, this animal also does attack ponderosa pine. So it will, in a pinyon, juniper area that's close to a stringer of ponderosa trees, this insect will attack ponderosa pine. Just real quick, signs of pinyon nips. One of the first telltale signs is a fading canopy, turns from green to that kind of straw colored. Once you remove the bark, just to kind of determine what's going on, here's a Y-shaped gallery. Again, this is an Ips species, so it's one of the characteristic signs of this insect. Doesn't take much effort. You can actually see the eggs with, just, without the aid of a loop, but a magnifying loop definitely helps. So these are the eggs that are laid on either side of these galleries. Reddish boring dust, that collects in bark fissures or at the base of trees is another sign to look for. In addition to pitch tubes that are kind of reddish in color, about the size of maybe penny or so. And when they're reddish in color, that is a good indicator that the insect has successfully attacked the tree and is now consuming the phloem tissue. And then right here, we've got grubs that are starting to create pupal chambers where they will complete their life cycle under the bark. And once they're adults, they'll exit the host and seek others. So interesting thing about pinyon nips, it is a multivoltine animal. It's capable of producing more than 5 generations per year, depending on the environmental conditions. So it's there, it's temperature driven. Right now, we're estimating that we're about in our fourth to fifth generation of bark beetles in some of the more prone areas of the state. And again, they can persist in non-drought years by capitalizing on, sick and diseased trees that they typically keep in check. But again, drought definitely predisposes large areas of for bark beetle attack. Um, with respect to treatments, when should people thin PJ stands? It definitely needs to occur during the coldest months, but that window of November through March, especially the last couple of years, has definitely shrunk on either side. It's warmer in November and it stays warmer through March. So the best thing to look at is just a temperature threshold of 55 degrees mean daily temperature is when insect activity really begins to occur, where they'll seek out hosts, they begin to fly, they begin to initiate their galleries and begin to lay eggs. So any thinning that should be done well below that 55-degree temperature. 45 degrees is a good period to consider doing any initiation of treatments to avoid predisposing standing trees to bark beetle attack if they as this bark beetle in addition to others can attack slash material, build up in that slash, and migrate to standing live trees. Western spruce budworm, as we move into defoliators, is the state's predominant defoliator of Douglas fir, true firs, and spruce. I didn't have too many good photos of Western spruce budworm, but it's got a funky signature, almost kind of like a dingy color. But you can miss this if the flight is too soon or too early, too late. You'll miss this dingy colored signature from the air. And last year, the number of acres that we mapped was 55,000 acres, which is significantly lower than in 2024. And it probably was because of just the timing of emergence. Things were a little warmer. And I think we may have just missed that window of opportunity just a little bit. Didn't see too much Western spruce budworm activity a month ago when we surveyed the upper elevations of northern New Mexico, but it'll be interesting to see what the actual numbers look like. Again, the majority of the activity does occur on national forests. Douglas fir tussock moth reared its head, a couple, 3 years ago, and it does attack Douglas fir. As the name suggests, white fir is actually a preferred host, and when they're very hungry, they will actually feed on pine trees. We're going to use the DFTM as just a little nickname for this insect as we talk about it. So this picture was over the Sandia Mountains. You can kind of see the East Mountain area down here to the right, and then I don't know if that's that I was going to say that's the cable to the tramway. I don't think so, but you could see all this discoloration all the way through here is a signature of Douglas fir tussock moth defoliation. They're strict defoliators. They don't girdle stems or feed on buds. In 2025, we mapped 42,000 acres compared to 18,000 acres in 2024. The majority, again, being on national forests, specifically in Santa Fe, Cibola, and the Carson. Right here, this is on Highway 518, heading southeast to Penasco from Taos. And all, again, these discolored trees have been attacked by Douglas fir tussock moth. With a large percentage of these trees being attacked 2 years in a row, there was quite a bit of mortality as a result of the trees not being able to respond to that defoliation event. But if a tree is attacked and defoliated, it can recover, given that it's not attacked 2 years in a row. This is a photo, an aerial photo of Hyde State Park. I was actually out there yesterday assisting with an assessment of mortality in the park to remove hazard trees. So all of the standing gray dead here is a result of Douglas fir tussock moth. And fortunately, with this animal, there's a naturally occurring organism, a nuclear polyhedrosis virus that actually collapses the population. And this year we haven't mapped any Douglas fir tussock moth. A brief outline of its life cycle. The female lays an egg mass actually right here. This little tan structure is the wingless female. She'll lay an egg, a mass of eggs, and that's how they overwinter. I peeled back some of the protective hairs from the female's body that she covers. And so you could see the pearly white eggs. Once as far as the phenology of trees, this animal coincides its emergence at bud burst. So you could see these instars, these neonate caterpillars, these first instar caterpillars emerging from that egg sac, and they'll stay there for a few days, and then they will, like spiderlings, they'll balloon from place to place, and that's how they disperse because the females are flightless, so the caterpillars have to get somewhere, and they use the silken thread to balloon from place to place. Right here on the lower left, we see second instar caterpillars that they feed just within the section on the face of a needle, and that causes that needle to die. And as they mature, they feed on all stages of needles. And right here, we've got a brown tannish pupal case and the mature caterpillar. My poor male sample right here, my specimen of this male moth does show the characteristic kind of a copper underwing, and it's very distinct plumose antenna that picks up the pheromone of the wingless female so that he can find the females to be mated. And interesting, fact, the caterpillars do possess urticating hairs that some people can be very allergic to. And as a precautionary, we ended up closing the Hyde State Park for a time because there was some people that ended up being impacted by these urticating hairs known as tussocosis. The naturally occurring virus that is exhibited by this wilted looking insect, the caterpillar, is what really causes the population to collapse. Once a caterpillar is infected, the virus replicates within the host, and it's somewhat stunning, but the caterpillars rupture, releasing millions of viral particles in the atmosphere, and multiply that by millions of caterpillars. That entire landscape, like in the third or fourth year of the outbreak, that population just completely collapses. But there are other naturally occurring enemies. In this case, a predatory stink bug. I was able to coax this one in a vial to actually feed on a small instar Douglas fir tussock moth. But ants, spiders, there's just a conglomerate of natural enemies of Douglas fir tussock moth caterpillars. But when there's millions and millions of caterpillars, they definitely predators themselves do not suppress the population. And I think I'm going to skip a couple of slides because we're getting down to the wire. I wanted to just mention real quick, abiotic conditions like drought can definitely cause ponderosa pine to discolor, kind of fade yellow. And then right here, I took this photo on the Turkey Mountains of a hail event, and I wasn't able to get back, but oftentimes you'll see just like a shredding of the needles, and a week or two, there's like a brown carpet of fresh needles. In conclusion, basically drought impacts insects, specifically bark beetles, and abiotic conditions definitely are on the horizon because we have just hotter and warmer conditions, especially this year. So thank you for your time. And if there is a moment or, a minute or two for questions, love to try to entertain them.
Yeah, Victor, I do want to respect people's time, so if you need to hop off, feel
Sure.
free to hop off. And I'll put some resources in the chat for folks if you're interested in connecting more with me or FACNM. But one of the questions that was in the chat was, what options in general do we have for managing beetle outbreaks, and is wildfire one effective form?
Yeah, thinning, dense stands, be it, mechanically or, low intensity fire to cull smaller diameter weakened trees definitely can be a tool to, reduce stand densities that have been, left unchecked for, decades.
And then, is there any correlation between mortality in dry mixed conifer areas that only became mixed after the exclusion of fire in ponderosa pine dominant forests?
Yeah, so we definitely see insects capitalizing on drought stress, and one of the things that is concerning, from the standpoint of forest health, is that we have now these large fuel loads on the landscape as a result of insect activity, but as well as the potential for increased fuel loads.
And then I think the last question we'll get to today is multispectral imaging from satellites like Landsat
Mm,
used to augment any aerial flights for assessing forest health conditions?
yeah. Really good question. There that can be done, especially if there's like very large outbreaks that I showed on a couple of the pictures that can determine, the variation from standing green to standing dead. But there is a nuance of the question in that there is something to the human eye, if you will, that can pick up
Is that one
certain things.
have sweetness?
Yeah, that can
I think I
pick
might
up
like that better.
you know
Oh yeah.
conditions that we can't see from
I made the
satellite imaging.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Victor,
Yeah,
so much for sharing everything and
sure.
sharing all those images.